Hello, my name is Carter Rains. Today I'm going to be talking about my analysis of the New Deal as a response to the Great Depression. Now, this paper was written to answer originally the question, was the New Deal an effective response to the Great Depression? The author was clear throughout the paper that they were going to review three different historians' perspectives or opinions regarding the effectiveness of the Depression, of the New Deal in regards to solving the issues of the Great Depression, and that these were the opinions of the first generation New Deal historians, the radical New Deal historians, and the conservative New Deal historians. And then at the end of the paper, the author comes to their own conclusions on which of these perspectives they thought best. So to analyze the paper, I looked at the format, the logic and organization of the paper, the writing itself, and then also the research and the documentation throughout the paper of the sources that the authors looked at. So it's kind of hard to tell, but up the top, these are color coordinated, and that the blue notes that are throughout this entire body of work in the write-up that I did on the paper is in blue. The research and documentation notes are in black. Any notes on logic and organization are in green, and then this reddish color is any reviews that I had or notes that I put down for writing. So to begin, let's talk about the format. The author overall did a very nice job, in my opinion, with the formatting. They did use Chicago Manual style as was required. It did have a cover sheet, as you can see here, a works cited page, and footnotes. So to begin, I wanted to talk about a couple of critiques revolving to the title page. Here, just a little small things that the title itself is required to be about 1/3 down the page. I thought it was about there, but I could have used to see it down just a little bit lower. And then down here, the information that is required to be given on the title page was properly double spaced. However, I did feel like one little thing was that the description of the course that the author was in whenever they wrote this paper needed to have the name of the class too, not just its number, and that the date at the bottom was incorrectly written. Going from there, throughout the entire paper, when the author did employ the use of footnotes, I felt like they did a really nice job of their formatting of these footnotes. All of them were in the correct order from page to the bottom here where the footnotes are. Their use of punctuation, the word order, and things of that nature were correctly done. The timeline of the Great Depression, this was a website that the author cited. They did that correctly, and then also throughout the entire thing, the way they did the books with their use of the italics regarding the title of the work cited, as well as the information that is required to be in the parentheses was shown continuously, as well as consistent use of page numbers for the books that the author decided to cite. I was limited in my own ability to review and analyze these sources because all but two of them actually were books that came straight out of the Southern Wesleyan Library that, due to the situations that we're in today, I was not able to access to really see the full accuracies of these citations. But from what I knew of the sources and what I could understand, it was done correctly and was well done. If we look down here at the works cited page, the end of the work, as you can see here, all the ones that I said were books. It's in alphabetical order, as was expected. The putting of again, those quotation marks, italics, things of that nature were well done. They put the names in the correct order as they were supposed to. One small thing was that for a bibliography, a works cited page, that these sources are not supposed to be double spaced, and they did in fact double space them, so that was an error. And then I had one possible problem with this encyclopedia citation, simply because they cited a link for it, but in my research I found that it was a book, or if the encyclopedia, it's very likely that it was an internet book, but I wasn't quite sure. And the citation that they used was the long one that seemed to come from the EBSCO, or the internet link that the SWU website library gives you, not the link of the actual website itself that this would have been on. So that would have been the wrong link, and that's due to its long nature and the main issue that I had with that citation. But overall, I felt like the formatting of the paper and structure was really solid in regards to their placement of sources. The one thing that I did continuously think that would have been very nice to put in regards to format would have been headings at the beginning of their paragraphs, simply because the paper did have clear and consistent flow and organization when reading the paper, but it would have been much easier to look back at the academic work to be able to read it for future reasons if there had been headings perfect, because they were talking about, again, as I mentioned earlier, the effectiveness of the New Deal in regards to those three main perspectives. So if they had been able to put a heading for first generation New Deal historians, and then for the radical New Deal historians and the conservative New Deal historians, and then their ultimate conclusions, then it would have been very easy for the reader to follow, and would have followed under the recommendations of Chicago Manual Style. But as you can see here, if we look down a little bit further, when the author begins talking about the first school of thought, there is no heading, and as you can here see this note, I put good topic, but would like the heading to be going before the sentence, just again to kind of give that easy flow, because the format of the paper goes with an introduction, a literature review of the different opinions, and then their ultimate conclusions based off the literature review and the arguments of those other historians. Next, I wanted to talk about the organization, and this organization kind of goes back to that formatting with the headings, and the organization, like I said, was well placed and well structured and set out in this introductory paragraph. In the introductory paragraph, the organization is clear whenever they talk about what the different perspectives were, that the organization clearly stamps out what the research question is, and then that they're going to go answering it with these three main schools of thought. And then at the end, the paper will conclude by dealing with which school of thought over the past 70 years is the most accurate position, and why that particular school of thought is the most accurate is what the author said. And I liked that. I thought it was clear, easy to follow. It has a clear introduction, body, and conclusion. The author, like I said, establishes that research question, but then the thesis itself was not actually stated until down here at the very bottom in the conclusions that the author came to based off their opinions on should be the 11th page. Right here, let's see, it says at the top of the author concludes that the New Deal was not the correct response to the Great Depression for several key reasons. They're clear that this is their thesis, this is what they think, but I did have a quibble with this, that the thesis does state what the author thinks, however, does not clearly list the reasons for it. Just says that there were several key reasons, and a proper thesis would include the reasons in the thesis itself and then explain it in the following paragraphs. I didn't think it was interesting that it was at the end of the paper, but I thought it was fitting due to the fact that they wanted to list what the three perspectives were and then let the reader be able to understand those without knowing what the author's bias could possibly be, or what they'd already decided in regards to what the evidence pointed to. And I thought that was a good choice organization-wise. So overall, I thought the organization was fairly done well, with just a couple of points that I thought could have been done better. In regards to the writing of the paper, in my first read of the paper, I was initially quite impressed and thought to myself that this was a really good paper. But after a couple of, and this was just simply because there was a lack of obvious mistakes, obvious misspellings, poorly placed commas, sloppy mistakes that could have been corrected with a good read over. But after looking at it more in depth, I did find a couple of issues, mainly with some word choice, some repetitive sentences, and a lack of pronouns. So in regard to the word choice, just a couple examples if you want to scroll up here to the top, just for a good example in this introductory paragraph. The author says the conventional wisdom is the stock market crash in 1929 caused the Great Depression. However, the stock market crash was not the lone reason as to why the Great Depression took place. Just the worst example, the conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is known to me to be practical knowledge that would be used in everyday uses. That's what conventional means. And I believe that the author was attempting to say something along the lines of general consensus, and just little things like that throughout the paper I marked out and found error with, but was not a overly dominating issue. A couple of other things with word choice, that the author tended to use overly dramatic languages in different situations. Again, just a couple of examples here right off the top on the introduction section of the paper. He says, or he or she says, when one thinks of the Great Depression, it is paramount that one considers the New Deal. And further down, as previously mentioned, it is necessary to address the overall effectiveness. Like the uses of the word paramount or necessary just make it seem like if you don't do it, you're not going to survive or something. It just seemed very dramatic and not very academic in its presentation of what they had to say, and I think it took away from their research and their actual points just by trying to overly dramatize the situations and what they had to say. And then in regards to some repetitive sentences, this repetition happened a couple of times. I just like the overall consensus here down here. I just kind of crossed out some of that just because I felt like it could be a bit repetitive. And then there was one main example down here more towards the bottom. Let me see. Yeah, so right here, whenever the author is stating their thesis, this was a perfect example. They're repetitive in that they state their thesis and their reasons for it. It was in addition, at the end, it's actually a conclusion of their thesis. In addition to the statistics, the natural cycles, and too much government intervention, the author also believes that the Great Depression was prolonged because of the New Deal. The main reason the author believes that the Depression was prolonged by the New Deal is because of all the programs and acts of the Roosevelt administration. So essentially, the author says that the problems were the statistics, the natural cycles, and too much government, and then later down that there was too much government involvement. So it was essentially just the same thing again. And also the use of the natural cycles was a point that the author had talked about, that they believed the economy under the flow of natural cycles would have taken its course, and that the New Deal was not necessary, and that was not a reason for why the New Deal did not work, but rather what they thought would have happened if the New Deal was not in place. So it wasn't even a reason at all, just a little bit of wordiness, getting nitpicky, but found a couple of similar issues throughout the paper. Those are some of the main examples that I found in regards to that. The author also did not like to use pronouns. The author named certain historians that they wanted to talk about involving what they had to say, and then would continuously use their name over and over and over again, and very little did they use of pronouns as he or she said this. For example, here in this paragraph, Best declared it the best way for the Roosevelt administration. Best claimed, Best also stated, and they just used their name, honestly, to an excessive point. Did the same thing with an author with the name of Lechtenberg and another point in the paper. And again, it just was over the top, and it took away from the flow and the word choice of the paper. Just seemed to kind of, again, take away from the way that the reader could read it itself. And I thought a couple of pronouns, a couple of he's, a couple of they's could have really helped in that flow in the read for the reader. So next, I want to talk about the appropriateness of their sources and whether or not the sources they used were cited correctly. As I pointed to earlier in the works cited page, most of these sources are very good sources in the fact that they're books from historians that were either there during the time or have taken extensive review of what happened. They were academically acclaimed from a lot of times from universities. Again, I was limited in my ability to review these sources, but because I did not have access to them. But the choice of using books was extremely correct and was proper use of source choice, and I thought that was very respectable. However, involving their actual implementation of these sources, I thought they did a very poor job of doing so. Too often throughout the course of the paper, the author fails to cite what these sources actually say, and actually borderline plagiarizes on a couple of different instances, and I'm going to point to those. The first time that the author does something to this nature was whenever they provided some historical context toward the beginning of the paper here around, yes, page 3. This paragraph here is talking about the 100 days of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, in which he comes to office and begins working with Congress on passing New Deal bills and laws in order to revamp the Great Depression. So he talks about all this historical, he or she talks about all this historical context involving the Great Depression, but fails to cite anything involving this context and where they got this information from. And I thought this was particularly interesting due to the lack of complete context that they gave. The history actually of the Great Depression was that in 1929 the Great Depression started, and then Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932 and then was sworn into office in 1933. And this 100 days is actually 3 to 4 years after the Depression actually started. But if you were to read this paper and had no understanding of history at all, you would completely miss that and would seem to think that these 100 days and this legislation that was passed so quickly would have happened at the very beginning of the Depression. And this was particularly faulty in that this seemingly intentional lack of contextualization shows itself again in the second perspective, and especially in the third perspective, whenever the author is discussing what the historian's views of the Great Depression were. If you look down here in the second perspective about the radical New Deal historians, is that he or she, the author talked about what their opinion was involving the onset of the Great Depression. Let's see if we can find it. See, again, if he had headings, if they put headings out, then this would have been a lot easier. Yes. The general defenders of the school on the programs should be right here. So, yes, here. So the radical New Deal historians, he uses the word from the onset of the Depression. So the radical New Deal historians were arguing that the Roosevelt administration did not do enough in their handling of the Depression, did not pass enough legislation, did not have enough government involvement, and that the author states that they did this from the beginning of the Depression. However, the New Deal was not responsible for the onset of the Depression simply because it wasn't until 3 or 4 years after this happened. I thought this was particularly important because this statement regarding the Depression from the onset had no citation. Up here, there's a citation in regards to previously stated points from an actual source, but in regards to the author's beliefs of what these historians believed from the beginning of the Depression had no citations in it. And I thought that was particularly important to note, and that this was even more clear in their final and most recently developed perspective as the conservative New Deal historians. So when the author is talking about these historians and what they believe, he has 3 historians that have 3 different bodies of work in the bibliography. However, in the paragraph that they find most of their evidence from, when in the final conclusion, comes right here when the author is talking about the opinions of Gary Best. and uses the phrases stated, declared, claimed, stated, asserted. They're circled in the black, but at no point in these paraphrases did the author actually cite anything that this author supposedly said. And the argument that the author is claiming Best made had some serious historical inaccuracies, because in this paragraph, the author is claiming that Best believed that if the government had taken a hands-off approach from the beginning, then the Depression would have cycled itself out very quickly from the beginning. And in fact, at another point in the paper, the author actually states that these historians believed that after 2 or 3 years, the Depression would have dissipated. But as I know from the actual historical context of what happened under the Hoover administration and the legislative body that was in at the time, for the first couple of years of the Depression, the 3 or 4 years longer than 2 or 3, there was very little government involvement. They did little to revamp the economy because they believed that it would take care of itself. And I thought this was the most crucial and faulty part of the paper, and where I found the most issue with. And this was not the only time that the author failed to cite the specific things that I thought was necessary in the paper, and what I felt like the author really failed in their research and their presentation of their opinions. So overall, my evaluation of the paper was that in regards to the format, organization, and writing, if I were to look at those 3 sections alone and give them a points at a scale of 100, that they would have received about 90 out of 100 points if it was just those 3 components of the paper. But then whenever it comes to the research and then the implementation of the research, the citations and things of that nature, I give them about half credit, 50 out of 100 points on the research itself. And I felt like the research was the most important part of any research paper, especially involving a literature review and a conclusion based off those opinions. The author has to cite those sources continuously, almost to a fault, if you're going to make a mistake. Oversighting is much better than underciting, and there was continuous problem with underciting throughout the paper. And so because of that, I rounded out to about 72 to 73, that range below C. If I were to give this paper a grade, even though, like I said, it was well written, most of the time the words were well done, the meat of a research paper is in the research, and especially in the citations of these researches, of this research. So overall, that's what I thought. But again, I'm no teacher, so I don't really know, but that's what I thought about it. And I just appreciate your time, and thank you so much.